The day I realized someone had built an entire house on my land, without my permission, I thought it had to be a mistake. But when I looked closer, I understood this wasn't an accident. It was a calculated gamble, and they assumed I'd stay silent. I own a stretch of land on the edge of a quiet development, the kind of place most people overlook because it isn't flashy. I inherited it years ago, paid the taxes myself, kept the paperwork clean, and never gave anyone a reason to question ownership. It wasn't part of any neighborhood association, and that detail would later become very important. For years, nothing happened. Then one spring morning, I noticed survey stakes along the tree line. At first, I assumed a nearby homeowner was expanding a fence or marking utilities. But within weeks, heavy machinery rolled in. Dump trucks, cement mixers, framing crews, all of it happening squarely on my property. I walked up to the site and asked the foreman what was going on. He barely looked at me before saying, HOA project. Approved plans. That was the first time I realized how deep this was about to go. According to him, the homeowners association from the nearby subdivision had greenlit a new community structure. A luxury build from what I could see. Stone foundation, upgraded framing, the kind of house meant to impress. And they were building it as if the land already belonged to them. I told him to stop immediately. He shrugged and said he'd check with the board. The machines didn't stop. If anything, construction sped up. That's when I started digging. I pulled my deed, clean, recorded, undisputed. Then I checked county permits. Something was off. The permits referenced a parcel number that didn't match theirs or mine. Someone had altered records just enough to push this through without triggering alarms. I contacted the HOA directly. The president, let's call him Martin Kessler, laughed it off. He told me their lawyers had verified everything and suggested I stop interfering before I made things worse for myself. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just arrogance. It was intimidation. They assumed I wouldn't have the time, money, or nerve to fight a fully funded HOA. They assumed I'd accept a settlement later or quietly back down once the house was finished. They assumed wrong. Because while they were pouring concrete and raising walls, I was assembling something far more dangerous to them: documentation. Surveys, environmental restrictions, zoning conflicts, and a paper trail that showed exactly how reckless they'd been. They thought building first would force my hand. What they didn't realize was that every nail they drove was making my case stronger. And once the house was far enough along, I made a decision that shocked everyone, including their lawyers. By the time the walls were up and the roof trusses arrived, the HOA believed they had already won, because in their world, progress equals power. They thought I'd blink once the structure looked permanent. Instead, I slowed everything down. I didn't rush into court. I didn't send threats. I let them keep building while I quietly gathered leverage. First, I hired an independent surveyor, someone with no ties to the county or the development. Within days, his findings confirmed what I already knew. The entire footprint of the structure sat well inside my boundary line. Not partially. Not accidentally. Completely. Next came zoning. The HOA had filed the build as a shared-use residential improvement, but my land was zoned differently, more restrictive. And buried in that zoning code was a clause they'd ignored. Any new construction required an environmental review because of protected runoff patterns in the area. That review had never happened. I filed a formal notice with the county planning office, not accusing anyone, just asking for clarification. That single letter triggered a pause order. Construction crews showed up one morning and were told to stand down until paperwork was verified. That's when the tone changed. The HOA board sent a legal letter claiming implied consent. arguing that because I hadn't stopped construction immediately, I'd forfeited my rights. Their lawyer even suggested the house could be retroactively annexed into the subdivision. It was a bold claim and completely wrong. I responded with one sentence: "I do not consent to any structure on my land. Remove it." No insults. No emotion, just facts. Behind the scenes, the board was scrambling. I know because one of the contractors called me directly, asking if we could work something out. Apparently, the HOA had promised them clean ownership and fast approvals. Now invoices were piling up and no one wanted to be left holding the bag. Then came the intimidation attempt. A board representative, Elaine Morwood, the vice chair, showed up unannounced. She spoke calmly but made sure to mention how expensive court could be and how associations always protect their own. She suggested a quiet payout, well below market value, in exchange for transferring the land after the build was complete. I declined. What she didn't know was that while they were focused on civil arguments, I had already sent the full file to a federal compliance office. The altered parcel references, the missing environmental clearance, the rushed permits, those weren't just mistakes. They were violations. And once federal oversight enters the picture, timelines disappear and consequences multiply. The HOA assumed this was a neighborhood dispute. They had no idea they'd crossed into something much bigger. And when the inspectors finally showed up on site, the HOA realized too late that finishing the house hadn't protected them. It had trapped them. The morning the inspectors arrived, the job site went silent, and that's when I knew the HOA's confidence was starting to crack. Two unmarked vehicles pulled up just after sunrise. No sirens, no drama, just clipboards, cameras, and people who don't bluff. The crew stood around pretending to be busy while the inspectors walked the perimeter, measuring, photographing, and quietly comparing notes. Every few minutes, one of them would glance at the property markers I'd installed the week before. Bright, unmistakable, and perfectly aligned with the official survey. The HOA president, Martin Kessler, showed up 20 minutes later, red-faced and talking fast. He tried to frame it as a boundary misunderstanding, insisting the association had acted in good faith. The inspectors didn't argue. They just asked for the environmental review file. There wasn't one. That's when things shifted. What had been treated like a local disagreement suddenly became a compliance issue. The inspectors explained, calmly, that construction on protected land without clearance wasn't a minor paperwork problem. It was a serious violation, one that carried mandatory remediation requirements. Construction was halted immediately, not paused, halted. The HOA's legal team jumped in that same afternoon, requesting meetings, proposing adjustments, floating compromise language. They suggested purchasing the land at a generous premium and continuing the build under revised permits. I listened, nodded, and asked a simple question. Why would I sell you something you never had the right to take? That question ended the conversation. Behind closed doors, the HOA board was panicking. The contractors wanted out. The lenders were calling. And the residents, who had been promised a showcase property, were starting to ask why their dues were funding a half-finished structure wrapped in caution tape. That's when the pressure turned inward. Emails surfaced showing the board had rushed approvals to meet a marketing deadline. Texts revealed they'd been warned about boundary concerns and ignored them. One message in particular stood out, a note from a consultant advising them to build first and resolve ownership later. That line would come back to haunt them. Meanwhile, the inspectors issued a formal finding. The structure sat entirely on private land, violated zoning restrictions, and disrupted a protected drainage corridor. The only approved remedy was full removal of the structure and restoration of the site. No fines could replace that requirement. No settlement could erase it. The HOA appealed. They delayed. They hoped time would soften the ruling. It didn't. Weeks later, the final order arrived. The house had to come down, every beam, every slab, at the HOA's expense, and the land had to be returned to its original condition, or better. The board thought this was the worst possible outcome. They were wrong. Because once demolition began, the real consequences finally started to surface. And as the first walls came down, something else collapsed right along with them. An illusion the HOA had relied on for years. When the first wall came crashing down, it wasn't just concrete and lumber hitting the ground. It was the HOA's image of control shattering in front of everyone. Demolition crews arrived early, escorted by compliance officers. This wasn't symbolic. It was mandatory. Every step was documented, photographed, and logged. The association had no flexibility left. They couldn't pause. They couldn't negotiate. They could only pay and comply. Residents gathered at the edges of the site, confused and whispering. Many had been told the house was a community upgrade, a smart investment that would raise property values. No one had mentioned that it sat on land the HOA didn't own. As debris piled up, the board tried damage control. Emails went out blaming clerical oversights and third-party consultants. But the paper trail told a different story. Internal messages showed deliberate shortcuts, warnings dismissed, objections overridden, and one recurring phrase that appeared again and again. "We'll handle it later." Later had arrived. What really unraveled them was the restoration requirement. Tearing down the structure wasn't enough. The land had to be returned to pre-construction condition. That meant soil testing, drainage correction, vegetation replacement, and third-party environmental sign-off. Every mistake they'd made now carried a price tag. The invoices started stacking up fast. Contractors charged premium rates for remediation work. Specialists billed for environmental surveys. Legal fees ballooned as the HOA tried, and failed, to push liability onto former consultants. And because the violations were classified as avoidable, their insurance refused to cover most of it. That's when the HOA board made another mistake. They attempted to recover costs by issuing a special assessment to residents. Thousands of dollars per household. The backlash was immediate. Homeowners demanded explanations, records, accountability. Some hired their own attorneys. Others requested board resignations. I didn't have to say a word. During one particularly tense meeting, a resident asked the board why they hadn't simply checked the deed before building. No one answered. Another asked why warnings had been ignored. Silence again. The truth was already out. By this point, my attorneys had shifted focus. Demolition and restoration were only part of the issue, the altered permits. The misrepresented parcel numbers, the pressure tactics. All of it pointed toward a larger claim, one that went beyond stopping the build. We filed suit for damages, not emotional damages, not punitive threats, just hard numbers. Loss of use, legal expenses, environmental disruption, administrative burden, every cost tied directly to their actions. The HOA thought compliance would end it. They hadn't realized it was only the beginning. Because once the financial consequences were laid out in court, the board finally understood how expensive handling it later could be. The moment the financial damage was put into numbers, the HOA's strategy collapsed because arrogance doesn't survive spreadsheets. In court, there was no room for spin, no speeches, no intimidation, just documents, timelines, and receipts. My legal team presented everything in sequence, showing how each decision the HOA made multiplied the damage. Not just to me, but to themselves. First came the direct costs: surveying fees, legal filings, environmental assessments, construction delays, remediation work. Every invoice was tied to a specific action the board had approved. Nothing speculative, nothing inflated. Then came the indirect losses. While the land was tied up in enforcement and demolition, I couldn't lease it. I couldn't develop it. I couldn't even access it freely without supervision. That loss of use had a value, and the court agreed it mattered. The HOA tried to argue that they'd acted under reasonable belief of ownership. That argument fell apart fast. Emails showed they'd been warned. Consultants had flagged discrepancies. One board member even admitted in writing that the parcel might not be ours, but pushed ahead anyway to meet a deadline. That single message shifted the tone of the case. Suddenly, this wasn't negligence. It was recklessness. The judge made it clear: associations don't get special treatment just because they represent a group. Authority doesn't excuse misconduct. If anything, it increases responsibility. The HOA's attorneys pivoted towards settlement. They asked for mediation. They suggested confidentiality clauses. They hinted at reduced payments if the case ended quietly. I declined. At this stage, it wasn't about revenge. It was about precedent. If they could build first, intimidate later, and walk away with a discounted apology, nothing would stop it from happening again, to me or to someone else. During testimony, the board president tried to paint the situation as a misunderstanding that spiraled. The judge stopped him mid-sentence and asked why the build continued after ownership was questioned. There was no answer. When closing arguments wrapped, the courtroom felt heavy. The HOA board sat rigid, no longer confident, no longer united. A few avoided eye contact entirely. Weeks later, the ruling came down. The court ordered full compensation for damages, plus penalties tied to regulatory violations and legal obstruction. The total amount was staggering, far beyond what the HOA had budgeted for, enough to force internal restructuring and years of financial recovery. For the first time since this began, the HOA had no moves left. But the final blow didn't come from the ruling. It came from what the HOA was forced to do afterward. The ruling hit the HOA hard, but what followed hit even harder, because winning in court was only the surface-level consequence of what they'd done. Once the judgment became public record, everything changed. Vendors who had worked with the association for years suddenly started asking questions. Lenders reviewed their exposure. Insurers reevaluated coverage. The HOA wasn't just a defendant anymore, it was a risk. The first fallout came from inside. Several board members resigned within days of the ruling, not quietly either. One stepped down citing personal reasons. Another blamed outside advisors. A third simply vanished from meetings altogether. Residents demanded explanations, and when none came, they demanded access to records. Those records told the full story. Emails, budget approvals, consultant warnings, all of it became available once homeowners invoked their rights. The same phrases kept appearing. Rush the timeline, deal with objections later, ownership will sort itself out. What had once been brushed off as board discretion now looked like systematic disregard for the law. Meanwhile, the financial pressure mounted. The association had to comply with the court order immediately. Funds were pulled from reserves. Planned projects were canceled. Maintenance budgets were frozen. And to cover the remaining balance, the HOA announced another assessment, this one even larger than the last. Residents pushed back. Some refused to pay, others hired attorneys. A few initiated action to dissolve the existing board structure entirely. Through all of this, I stayed out of the spotlight. I didn't give interviews. I didn't gloat. I let the process speak for itself. Because the more the HOA talked, the worse it sounded. What surprised people most was how calm everything felt on my end. The land was restored, the site cleared, native vegetation replanted. Standing there months later, you'd never know a house had ever been built, except for the paper trail and the consequences still unfolding. The HOA attempted one last move, a quiet appeal, hoping to reduce the financial burden. It went nowhere. The ruling was solid, the documentation airtight. No higher court wanted to touch it. By then, the lesson was clear. Power without boundaries collapses under scrutiny. Authority doesn't replace ownership. And shortcuts always cost more than doing things right. I didn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. I just refused to let someone take what wasn't theirs. And in the end, that refusal reshaped an entire association. But the most unexpected outcome wasn't financial or legal. It was how quickly behavior changed once consequences became real. Once the money was paid and the damage undone, you'd think the story would be over. But that's when the HOA's behavior shifted in a way no one expected. Almost overnight, the association became cautious. Not careful, cautious. Meetings that once flew through approvals now dragged on for hours. Every motion was reviewed, every vote documented. Every decision passed through multiple layers of legal review. The same board that once rushed construction without confirming ownership now hesitated over landscaping changes. The fear wasn't subtle. Residents noticed it immediately. Requests that used to be denied with boilerplate emails were suddenly approved without resistance. Enforcement letters stopped arriving. Fines quietly disappeared from accounts. The HOA that once acted untouchable now seemed unsure of its own authority. Word had spread. Other associations in the area had taken notice of the case. Board members from nearby developments started asking questions about boundaries, easements, liability. Attorneys began advising caution instead of confidence. The idea that an HOA could simply push forward and sort it out later was gone. For me, life returned to normal. The land sat open and undisturbed, exactly as it should have been all along. I walked it occasionally, not to inspect damage, but to appreciate the quiet. No machinery, no tape, no warning signs. Just ground that was finally left alone. What struck me most was how avoidable all of it had been. If the HOA had paused for a single day to confirm ownership, none of this would have happened. If they'd listened to their own consultants, the house never would have gone up. If they'd respected a clear boundary, they wouldn't have paid a price that reshaped their future. But arrogance has a way of blinding people to simple solutions. Months later, I received a letter from the association. Not legal, not threatening, just an acknowledgement. It confirmed the judgment had been satisfied, the land restored, and that the HOA recognized my ownership without reservation. No apology, none was needed. The real apology was in their actions or lack of them. They no longer tested limits. They no longer assumed silence meant consent. They no longer treated private property as an obstacle to be managed. They learned, and others did too. Because stories like this travel fast, especially among people who believe power protects them from consequence. This one proved the opposite. But the final realization didn't hit me until much later, when I understood exactly why standing my ground had mattered so much. It wasn't until everything had settled that I realized this story was never really about a house. It was about what happens when people confuse authority with ownership. Months had passed since the land was restored. Grass had grown back, the soil had settled. If you didn't know where to look, you'd never guess a full structure once stood there. That was intentional. I wanted the land returned to what it was, not turned into a monument to conflict. What lingered wasn't physical, it was reputational. The HOA's name now carried weight, and not the kind they wanted. Real estate agents mentioned the case quietly during listings. Attorneys referenced it in consultations. Board members in other communities used it as a cautionary example during meetings. It became shorthand for what not to do. The irony was that the HOA still existed. It still collected dues. It still enforced rules, but it did so carefully, almost timidly. Power, once unchecked, had learned restraint. I was asked more than once why I didn't push further, why I didn't seek additional penalties or publicity. The answer was simple: the system had worked. The law had done exactly what it was designed to do: correct overreach, restore balance, and deter future abuse. There was no satisfaction in humiliation. The satisfaction came from clarity. Clarity that private property means something, that documentation matters, that no organization, no matter how confident, gets to rewrite boundaries because it's convenient, and that intimidation fails when met with patience and preparation. Looking back, the most dangerous moment wasn't when construction began. It was when I could have been pressured into accepting it. When it would have been easier to settle quietly, take a payout, and let the mistake become permanent. That's how bad precedents are born. Instead, I chose the harder path, not out of spite, but out of principle. And that choice rippled outward. People who had never questioned their HOA before started reading bylaws. They checked plats. They asked uncomfortable questions. Transparency increased, not because of goodwill, but because accountability had been enforced. That's how real change happens, not through speeches, not through outrage, through consequences that are documented, measured, and impossible to ignore. The house was gone, the money was paid, the land was restored, but the lesson stayed. And that lesson became crystal clear the next time I drove past the development and noticed something that hadn't been there before. The first sign that things had truly changed wasn't a letter or a meeting. It was a boundary marker quietly placed where no one dared cross anymore. Driving past the development one afternoon, I noticed new survey stakes along the edges of multiple properties. Fresh paint, updated signage, clear, unmistakable lines. The HOA hadn't announced it, but the message was obvious. Boundaries now mattered. It wasn't just my land. Nearby parcels that bordered association property had been resurveyed as well. Easements were clarified, records updated. What once would have been brushed off as close enough was now treated with precision. The association had learned the cost of guessing. Residents felt the shift too. HOA communications became formal and cautious. Requests were routed through attorneys. Any project involving land alteration, even minor ones, required verification. The same board that once rushed a full-scale build without ownership certainty now double-checked mailbox placements. And no one complained, because everyone understood why. For years, many homeowners had quietly assumed the HOA always knew what it was doing. That assumption was gone. In its place was awareness, an understanding that authority works best when it stays within limits. I was approached by a few residents privately. Some thanked me. Others admitted they'd been uneasy about the construction from the start but didn't think they could challenge it. One person said something that stuck with me. "I didn't know we were allowed to say no." That sentence explained everything. People often comply not because something is right, but because they assume resistance is pointless. This situation proved otherwise. It showed that preparation, patience, and a paper trail can balance even the most confident overreach. On my end, nothing more was required. Taxes paid, deed intact. Land untouched, no follow-ups. No appeals, just quiet ownership exactly how it should be. The HOA never contacted me again. No updates, no requests, no future collaboration. They didn't need to. The line had been drawn, literally and figuratively. Sometimes the strongest statement isn't a confrontation. It's consistency. Standing firm once, correctly, can change behavior for years. Looking at those boundary markers, I realized the impact of the situation had expanded far beyond me. It had reshaped how an entire community understood limits, responsibility, and consequence. And that's when I knew the story was nearly complete, because the final moment of clarity came not from the HOA, but from what I decided to do next. The real ending didn't arrive in a courtroom or a meeting. It arrived quietly when I chose to do nothing at all. After everything that happened, there was one question people kept asking. What was I going to do with the land now? Build on it, sell it, fence it off permanently? They expected a dramatic conclusion. Instead, I left it exactly as it was. No construction, no development, no statement. Just open ground, maintained and respected. The choice surprised some people, but to me it felt right. The land had never been about profit or leverage. It was about ownership and principle. By not rushing to use it, I sent a final message without saying a word. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a reset. Life moved on. The HOA stabilized under new leadership. Budgets were reworked. Processes changed. And slowly, trust began to rebuild, not because of apologies, but because of restraint. Every now and then, I still pass the area. Nothing draws attention anymore. No markers being moved. No machinery arriving unannounced. Just quiet compliance with boundaries that should have been obvious from the start. That's the thing about consequences when they're handled properly. They don't need to be repeated. One clear example can do more than years of warnings. I didn't enjoy the conflict. I didn't seek it. But I also didn't avoid it when it mattered. And that balance made all the difference. If there's one takeaway from this experience, it's simple. Never assume someone else's authority overrides your rights. Ask questions. Check documents. And don't be afraid to stand still while others rush, because rushing is where mistakes are made. What began as an unauthorized structure ended as a lasting correction, not just for one association, but for everyone watching. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think twice about property, power, or standing your ground, then consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments.